Welcome to Unholy Inquiry, where each tale leads you deeper into a labyrinth of mystery waiting to be uncovered. This time, join us as we delve into Hercule Poirot and the Widow's Lie, a fan-crafted story that pays homage to the genius and sophistication of Agatha Christie's iconic detective, Hercule Poirot. We are thrilled to have you with us on this captivating journey. Share your thoughts, let us know where you're tuning in from, and if you spot any details we missed, your feedback is invaluable. Together, let's continue to shape even more thrilling enigmas. Chapter 1. The Scream Behind the Veil. A scream shattered the quiet of the manor like glass struck by lightning, sharp, female, and unmistakably real. It didn't echo, it hung, trembling in the velvet air of the drawing room, as if reluctant to die. Hercule Poirot had just lifted his cup of tisane when Lady Eveline Hargrove, swathed in her widow's veil, stumbled backwards from the draped portrait of her late husband and collapsed into a heap of black silk and trembling limbs. "Mon Dieu," Poirot murmured, setting his cup down without a clink. That, Hastings, was not grief. That was terror. The old manor, Wraithmoor House, perched on the edge of Dorset's cliffs like a spider crouched in its web. Windows narrow as slits, walls worn and whispering with age. The wind clawed at its stones, and the sea below growled like a sleeping giant. Poirot, recently invited under the pretense of a routine legal matter involving the late Colonel Archibald Hargrove's will, now stood at the epicenter of something far darker. He moved through the room with the meticulous grace of a surgeon, eyes sweeping every detail: the overturned chair, the way Lady Hargrove's glove had torn, the faint scent of jasmine, no, not jasmine, lilies, funeral lilies. Lady Eveline clutched her veil like it was all that tethered her to the earth. It was behind me," she whispered. Archie was standing. Behind me. I felt him." "Madame," Poirot said gently, kneeling beside her, "you saw something?" "I saw nothing, but I heard the scream. It wasn't mine. I swear to you, it wasn't mine." 3 other guests stood frozen. Edward Langford, the late Colonel's longtime solicitor and executor; Lillian Hargrove, the Colonel's estranged niece from Oxford, who hadn't seen him in 5 years; and Cyril Venn, the dashing family friend and former soldier whose handshake had been just a shade too firm for a man hiding grief. Poirot studied each of them as if flipping pages in an open book. "So," he said finally, rising, "we begin. Yes, the scream. It leads us somewhere. But where? That is the little puzzle, n'est-ce pas? The body had not even been buried 2 full days. Colonel Archibald Hargrove, hero of North Africa, lover of clocks and ancient coins, had been found in his study, collapsed by the fireplace, clutching a letter in his fist, heart stopped by what the village doctor had called natural causes. But death, as Poirot well knew, was rarely natural in houses that breathed secrets. Acting as if absent-minded, Poirot returned to the study that evening under the excuse of retrieving a forgotten umbrella. Hastings trailed him. "What are you thinking, Poirot?" "I think," Poirot said, running a finger along the edge of a dusty shelf, "that the Colonel, he did not die of fear, nor age. He died because someone required him dead, and someone else, someone in this house, wants us to believe his spirit walks among us." He stopped suddenly. His eyes narrowed on a photograph half hidden behind a stack of ledgers. A woman with dark hair and a stare that seemed to follow the room. "She is not Lady Eveline." "No," said Hastings. "That's the Colonel's first wife. Died 10 years ago. Drowned during a storm. Tragic accident. Poirot murmured. So many accidents in a single family. The next morning brought rain that tapped on the glass like skeletal fingers. Poirot called the household to the drawing room for a quiet but focused conversation. "Let us speak openly," he began. "We are gathered because of a scream. But it is not the scream that interests me. It is what came before." Langford stiffened. "Before?" "Yes," Poirot said, eyeing him. "You arrived late, Mr. Langford. You claimed your carriage was delayed by the storm, and yet the roads were dry." Langford blinked. I may have taken the long route." Poirot waved him off. "Bah, perhaps, but consider. A will was signed 2 days before the Colonel's death. Witnessed by you and Cyril Venn," Langford said. "We were both present." Poirot turned to Cyril. "You saw him sign it?" "I did," Cyril said, but his voice lacked conviction. "And yet," Poirot said, "the ink blot on the second page suggests the Colonel's hand was shaking. More than a man simply elderly. Was he ill, monsieur?" "Not that I knew of." Poirot clasped his hands behind his back. "And Miss Lillian," he turned to her, "you arrived the morning after the Colonel's death, no?" "I came as soon as I heard. We were never close." "Never close, yet he left you nothing in the will. Curious. Did that sting, mademoiselle?" Lillian's nostrils flared. "I don't need his money." "Ah," Poirot said softly, "but do you need justice?" Late that night, a new sound stirred Wraithmore. The delicate tapping of piano keys, faint, hesitant. Poirot followed it to the music room, where the grand piano lay draped in a black cloth. No one sat there. Yet the keys were warm to the touch. Lady Evelyn appeared in the doorway like a wraith. "He used to play," she said. "When the sea was rough, he'd play to calm his nerves." "Tell me," Poirot said, "did your husband believe in ghosts?" Her eyes flicked toward the fireplace. "No, but he believed in revenge." That was the first twist. The next morning, Poirot stood at the top of the stairs, staring down at the entrance hall with a gaze as still as ice. The scream, "Mes amis," he called, was heard in the drawing room. But what if I told you? The scream came from beneath the floorboards. A hush fell. They gathered, Poirot leading them to the study, where he gently peeled back a fraying rug. Beneath it, an iron ring embedded in the wood. He pulled, revealing a narrow trapdoor. The steps descended into a stone-walled chamber, cold, damp, and windowless. In the center, a chair, ropes, a torn scrap of veil. "Someone," Poirot said grimly, "was kept here. Recently." Cyril stepped forward, pale. "Impossible. That cellar's been sealed for years. But someone had the key. Someone who knew this house well. Perhaps someone who wished to make Lady Evelyn believe she was haunted." A candle's flicker cast a shadow across the wall. Poirot turned sharply. His gaze landed on Langford. "You were in love with her," Poirot said quietly. Langford blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "You drafted the will. You witnessed the signature, and you knew. If the Colonel died naturally, the estate passed to Lady Eveline. But if suspicion fell upon her, you can't prove." "I do not need to prove. I only need to observe. Your hands trembling when I mentioned the ink, the scent of lilies, on your coat, not hers. You left the flower beside the portrait to remind her of her first husband's funeral, to unnerve her." "But I didn't kill Archie," Langford snapped. "I loved her." "Yes," Poirot said, voice soft now. "But so did Cyril." All heads turned. Cyril's face was unreadable. "I thought it was over," Cyril said. "Years ago, she and I, before she married the colonel. Then he returned from the war, and, well, duty, money. I stepped aside." Poirot stepped closer. "And you regretted it." So when the colonel's heart began to fail, yes, Poirot knows these things, you saw opportunity. You witnessed the will, yes, but the original had a different clause, half the estate to you, for services rendered. You destroyed it, signed a new one, made it look like Langford's plan. "You can't," Cyril began, but Poirot cut him off. "I can, because only one person could have laced the colonel's tonic with powdered foxglove. A soldier would know how much would kill without leaving a trace, and only one person had access to the wine decanter the night before the heart failed." Lady Eveline gasped. "Cyril, I did it for you," Cyril cried out, suddenly unhinged. "He kept you locked in this place like a trophy. You were miserable. He never loved you. But I did." "And so you murdered him," she said, voice shaking. "I freed you." "No," Poirot said. "You enslaved her to a lie." Silence. Then the sound of the sea, pounding like judgment. Cyril was arrested that night, quietly, without resistance. Poirot watched from the balcony as the carriage wheels ground against the gravel. Behind him, Hastings said, "It's tragic." He thought he was saving her. Poirot stared into the storm. "There is no salvation in deception, mon ami. Only deeper prisons." He turned, pausing only once more. "And remember this, when a heart breaks, it does not scream. It whispers." The scream we heard was not of a ghost, but of a soul torn between love and horror. And in the stillness that followed, Wraithmore stood silent again, its veil lifted, its secrets laid bare. Chapter 2. A teacup full of ashes. The ashes in the teacup were still warm. That was the first thing Poirot noticed as the butler trembled beside the tray, the fine porcelain rattling faintly against the silver. A faint trail of smoke curled upward from the scorched remains within the cup, a delicate bone china vessel meant for jasmine or Darjeeling, now tainted by something darker. Miss Eleanora Hargrove stared at it as though it were a dead animal placed before her. "I don't understand," she whispered, her voice barely louder than the wind clawing at the shutters. "I made the tea myself. There was nothing in it when I poured the water." "Pardon, mademoiselle," Poirot said, stepping forward with the graceful caution of a man who knew too well that the most dangerous fires were those that had already burned. But something was placed inside this cup, something precious, at least to someone, and now it is ash. The drawing-room, still bruised with the shadows of the previous night's scream, held its breath. Poirot's gaze moved slowly, precisely, from the fireplace that no longer burned to the velvet curtains still swaying from a breeze that had long since passed. The storm outside had softened to a drizzle, but the sea beyond Wraithmore's cliffs remained restless, a constant murmur of secrets not yet buried. The scent of damp stone and scorched paper mingled with the faint perfume Miss Eleanora wore, violets, youthful, and a touch too sweet. Poirot turned to the butler, a wiry man named Cray, whose thin moustache twitched like a lie under pressure. "Tell me, monsieur, who placed the tray here?" Cray's voice was tight. "Miss Hargrove requested it. I prepared it as always. I brought it to her, then left the room." "No interruptions?" "None. No one else entered this room." "Not to my knowledge." Poirot's eyes flicked to the cup. "And yet, someone did." and they brought not tea, but a secret that could not be buried, could not be confessed, and so it was burned. Miss Eleanor's hand moved instinctively toward her locket, the silver chain catching a stray glint from the chandelier. She was the Colonel's niece, just 23, poised and well-educated, recently returned from the continent after studying art history in Vienna. Her return to Wraithmore was unexpected, poorly timed, and, according to some, unwanted. But she had insisted it was family duty. And now there were ashes in her teacup. The others entered with wary steps. Lady Eveline, pale but collected, still wearing the widow's black silk. Mr. Langford, the solicitor, who had grown quieter since Poirot's inquiries the night before, and a new face, Miss Beatrice Vale, the Colonel's former secretary, a sharp woman of 35, with severe features and a voice like dry parchment. She had not been seen in the house since the funeral, but now claimed she had matters to settle and personal effects to retrieve. "How curious," Poirot murmured. "So many return to Wraithmore only when the dead can no longer speak." Miss Vale narrowed her eyes. "Are you implying something, monsieur?" "Ah, mademoiselle," Poirot replied, folding his hands. "I imply nothing. I observe, and I observe that you did not attend the reading of the will. I had no intention of contesting it. Yet you are here now. I needed closure." Poirot looked at her laced gloves. "Closure often leaves fingerprints, non?" The day passed, with tension thick enough to slice. Poirot wandered the house with Hastings, the conversation low but pointed. "There is something we are not seeing," Poirot said softly. "Not just in the ashes, but in what preceded them. Someone feared what that object represented. It was destroyed not to conceal, but to silence." "A letter," Hastings guessed. "Perhaps, or something smaller. A photograph, a note, something personal." That evening, Poirot requested tea once more in the drawing room, this time prepared by Cray under his direct supervision. As the guests assembled, Poirot sipped slowly, watching every eye. Lady Eveline barely touched hers. Miss Vale drank without blinking. Langford held his with a lawyer's detachment. Miss Eleanor, though, refused entirely. "I'm sorry," she said. "After what happened earlier, I can't stomach it." "Understandable," Poirot said gently, "but curious. I don't see how. You claim to have made the first cup, but if you did, then who placed the contents inside? It was not in the kettle. The tray was untouched. So when, mademoiselle, was it added?" She said nothing. "That's because," Poirot continued, "the ashes were not left behind by accident. They were meant to be found, and you knew what they once were." No, I didn't." Poirot raised a hand. "Let us go back. To the night the Colonel died. You were not yet here, no? But you arrived the following morning. What did you do first?" "I went to the study." "Why?" To remember him." "You removed something, mademoiselle." "Something from his desk." Her hands tightened. "The lock was scratched." "You used a hairpin. Mon Dieu, you did not even realign the blotter afterward." Eleanor's lip trembled. "I didn't kill him." "I believe you," Poirot said. "But you took something. What was it?" She faltered. Then, "A letter? From my mother." "Ah," Poirot said, stepping forward. "The first wife. The one who drowned." Eleanor nodded slowly. "He kept it hidden. I only found out through a slip in a telegram months ago. I thought perhaps there was something, some truth. I was afraid it would ruin him even in death. So I burned it." In a teacup, Poirot said. A most English form of execution. Langford cleared his throat. Surely this is a family matter, Monsieur Poirot, not a crime. But the colonel did not die of natural causes, Poirot said, his voice razor-sharp now. That is what I now believe. All eyes turned. Poirot went on. Last night I examined the decanter, and the stopper, it had a faint ring of residue. He drank brandy every night, but this stopper had not been removed in several days, which means someone else gave him his final drink. The storm had returned now, thunder growling in the distance. Poirot's voice cut through the tension. I believe the colonel was poisoned, slowly, over time. Foxglove was not used, nor digitalis, but an alkaloid, tasteless, odorless, slow. Beatrice Vale stiffened. You recognize it, mademoiselle? Of course you do. You were his secretary, and you are trained in chemistry. Oxford, class of 1913, yes? She did not speak. You were in love with him once, Poirot continued, but he married another, and kept you nearby, under the cruel title of assistant. You stayed out of pride, but when he rewrote the will to give everything to Lady Eveline, Miss Vale's voice cracked like dry earth. He said I was a fool, that no one would ever believe me. So you ensured he would be believed by silence. But I didn't count on her, she hissed, nodding toward Eleonora. She was just a girl. She wasn't supposed to come back. She found the letter, Poirot said softly, and so you tried to frighten her, planting the ashes in the teacup, but you only made the lie louder. Beatrice Vale was taken away in the same carriage that had once delivered the will. Langford refused to meet anyone's eye. Lady Eveline stood by the window, veil lifted at last, as the sea broke against the rocks far below. Eleonora came to Poirot in the hallway. Thank you, she said, for not humiliating me. Poirot bowed slightly. Mademoiselle, we do not choose the sins of our parents, but we may choose not to carry their ashes. Later that evening, Hastings asked, Do you think she'll ever read what was in that letter? Poirot looked into his cup. Perhaps. But some truths, Hastings, are like fire. We warm ourselves by them, or we burn. And somewhere, far below, the waves carried secrets that even ashes could not hide. Chapter 3. The letter she burned twice. The fire was dying, but something in the hearth still hissed. A blackened scrap curled inward like a closing eye, its edge glowing red before vanishing into ash. Lady Eveline stood barefoot on the cold stone floor, her widow's veil removed, her fingers shaking as she stared into the embers. When Poirot entered the drawing room, silent as the hour that precedes death, he saw the tears before she wiped them away. You shouldn't be here, she whispered. Poirot paused, his gaze sweeping the room like a tide lapping at secrets. And yet, he said gently, I am, because of what you tried to destroy. I didn't try, she replied. I succeeded. Ah, Poirot murmured, but a letter may burn only once on paper, madame. If it burns again in the heart, it is not gone, it is merely hidden. She said nothing. Outside, the wind moaned along the edges of Wraithmore House, the storm still lingering at the edge of the cliffs, like a beast unwilling to retreat. The flames snapped again, spitting up a final puff of smoke. Poirot stepped forward and with a silver poker gently stirred the ashes. A thin curl of something red emerged, wax perhaps, or the remnant of a wax seal, a broken sigil. He leaned in. Madame, he said without looking at her, did your late husband know? Her voice cracked. He suspected. Then you understand, of course, that I must know what was in that letter. She sank into the armchair. You'll find nothing but ghosts in those ashes. Mais non, Poirot said softly. The ashes tell me much, but they do not lie like the living. The house had changed since the night of the scream. The guests no longer spoke in normal tones. Everyone whispered, as if even words might betray them. Poirot had returned to Wraithmore at the insistence of the late Colonel's solicitor, Mr. Langford, who claimed a new development had emerged, one that might render the will invalid. That development had been a letter, and now that letter was ash. But it had not been destroyed when first written. Poirot had seen the faint scent of sealing wax in the study 3 days prior, tucked behind the Colonel's copy of Cicero's De Officii, and Lady Evelyn's fingertips bore the faintest trace of soot, older than tonight. She had burned the letter twice. It was the first burning that interested Poirot. He interviewed the suspects anew, this time under the guise of preparing an official statement for the estate. Mr. Langford, now more cautious, wore a pinched expression and polished his glasses constantly. I didn't see the letter myself, he insisted. The Colonel mentioned it to me, said he had written something irrevocable. But it was gone when I arrived. And when was that? Poirot asked. An hour before his death. I was meant to witness a codicil. He never opened the safe. Poirot frowned. And what of Miss Eleonora? She was in the garden, sketching. That's what she told me. Poirot next visited Eleonora, who had grown withdrawn since Miss Vale's arrest. Her eyes no longer darted with uncertainty. They were calm, too calm. I heard about the letter, she said. Aunt Eveline was in tears last night. She wouldn't say what it was. Do you believe she wrote it? Poirot asked. I think she received it. From whom? I don't know, but it frightened her. Poirot tilted his head. Fear is a powerful motivator, mademoiselle. It causes us to lie, to confess, and sometimes to destroy. And yet, Eleonora said, meeting his gaze, you keep searching the ashes. Because ashes are pure, Poirot replied. They cannot lie. A new presence arrived at Wraithmore that afternoon, a man of middle years with a military bearing and a cane that tapped with impatience. Major Howard Rathbone. He claimed to be an old comrade of the Colonel's and the only one aware of the truth. Truth? Poirot asked. That is a word that likes to dress in disguise. Rathbone ignored him. Archie and I served in Tripoli together. We shared everything, including secrets. He told me before his death that he had written to Eveline about something from our past, something she had the right to know. Poirot's eyes narrowed. And you have come to ensure that secret stays buried. I've come to make sure it doesn't ruin what's left of him. The second twist arrived that evening. Poirot sat alone in the Colonel's study, reading a collection of poetry by Christina Rossetti, when he noticed the candlelight glinting off a picture frame. The portrait had shifted slightly. Beneath it, tucked into the back, was a folded scrap of scorched parchment, not fully burned, preserved, almost deliberately, between glass and gilt. He removed it gently. Only a few words remained. You must never know what happened in Tripoli. If you ever read this, forgive me. Signed not by the Colonel, but by Eveline. Ah, Poirot whispered. So the letter was hers. Written before, and the Colonel, he kept it. The question now was, why had she burned it again? Act 3 began with a lie. Poirot told Lady Eveline he had discovered the full contents of the letter, that he knew about what happened in Tripoli. She paled. Her fingers dug into the velvet armrest. So, she breathed, He did keep it. He did. And you destroyed it. Why? Because, she said through clenched teeth, he wasn't supposed to forgive me. Poirot stood very still. You feared forgiveness? I feared what it would do to me. Slowly, like ink bleeding through wet parchment, the truth emerged. Years ago, in Tripoli, Eveline had been engaged to another man, Captain Rathbone. But their affair ended badly, violently. She fled. The colonel, unaware of the full details, met her soon after and married her, believing her to be pure, untouched by scandal. But Rathbone returned from the war. He sent letters, threatened to reveal the past. Eveline, in desperation, confessed the truth in a letter to her husband. Years later, he never confronted her, but he kept the letter, and on the eve of his death, he made a decision. He wrote a codicil to the will, giving half the estate to a war widow's charity, perhaps his final attempt to cleanse the past. But Eveline, discovering the letter again, feared it would undo everything. She burned it, first in secret, and then again, theatrically, in the drawing room, hoping to blame its ashes on Eleonora. Poirot pieced it all together at the final gathering. I now understand the second burning, he said, but the first? That was an act of desperation. And yet you burned your own words. Yes, Eveline whispered, but not the guilt. He turned to Rathbone. And you, monsieur, you threatened her for years. Rathbone sneered. She deserved worse. Poirot approached slowly. You drove her to silence. But in silence, there is no absolution, only repetition. He turned to the others. This house has tried to bury more than one body, but the truth, like ash, settles into every crevice. Eveline was not arrested. Her crime was not murder, but concealment. Rathbone, however, was escorted out, disgraced, exposed, and trembling. That night, Poirot sat in the drawing room, watching the last of the embers collapse. Hastings asked, "Do you think she'll be free now?" Poirot stirred his tea, slowly. Freedom, mon ami, is not the absence of chains. It is the courage to look at what you once burned, and not flinch. The wind howled outside, as Wraithmore slept under the weight of secrets made visible. Chapter 4. The Man Who Was Never Buried. The gravedigger dropped his spade with a scream. The hollow clank of metal against stone echoed up from the open earth, sharp and jarring in the morning mist. Beneath the weightless wood of the coffin lid, no body, just linen, neatly folded, undisturbed. The earth had been prepared, the mourners had wept, the casket had been lowered, and yet, when exhumed 3 days later under legal order, the grave was as empty as the day it was dug. Monsieur Poirot, the vicar stammered, his hands trembling as he stepped back from the edge of the disturbed grave. There was a man in that coffin. We saw him. The body was there. I swear to you, it was there. Non, monsieur le curé, Poirot said calmly, peering down into the grave. You saw what you believed was a body, but belief is the most dangerous illusion, especially when dressed in black velvet and surrounded by tears. A chill clung to the churchyard like damp wool. Wraithmore's headstones leaned like drunkards in the fog, the morning sun too timid to cut through the gloom. Hercule Poirot stood at the grave of Arthur Brampton, merchant, philanthropist, and, as of last week, deceased. Or so everyone believed, and yet the grave was empty. The casket was sealed, said Hugh Denley, the undertaker's assistant, his voice pinched with confusion. We followed protocol. He was embalmed, clothed, laid out under witness. I helped lower him in myself. Did you see his face? Poirot asked without turning. I no, Denley admitted. He was already in the shroud. The colonel insisted on privacy, said it was a closed casket service. Poirot lifted one elegant brow. Ah, yes. Closed casket. How convenient. He turned toward the three people, watching from the edge of the church path, each dressed in mourning, each a player in a tragedy that had only just begun. First, there was Beatrice Brampton, the young widow, veiled in black, her hands clasped so tightly the lace of her gloves tore slightly at the knuckles. A former stage actress, she had married Arthur less than a year ago. Their wedding had shocked many in Wraithmore, as had Arthur's abrupt death 2 weeks past from natural causes. Beside her stood Lionel Brampton, Arthur's estranged younger brother. Where Arthur had been dignified and controlled, Lionel was sharp-edged and erratic. Rumors of gambling debts and a failed mining venture had shadowed him for years. He'd returned to Wraithmore only for the funeral and had not left since. Last was Dr. Charles Ambrose, the local physician and lifelong friend of Arthur's. Respectable, respected, and entirely too composed. He had signed the death certificate without hesitation, citing heart failure. Poirot studied their faces one by one. Beatrice's eyes were red, but her lashes were untouched by tears. Lionel watched Poirot with an almost amused interest, as though waiting for a magician's final act. Dr. Ambrose stood stiff, his hands behind his back, offering nothing. Mademoiselle Beatrice, Poirot said gently, when your husband died, did you see his body? She hesitated. No, he died during the night. The doctor said, Yes, Poirot interrupted. But did you see him? No, Arthur had asked me not to enter the room. He'd become very private in the last weeks. He was unwell and proud. Indeed, Poirot said. And what was it, I wonder, that he wished to hide? Act 1 had ended with an empty grave. Act 2 began with a locked room. Poirot insisted on visiting Brampton House that very afternoon. The room where Arthur had allegedly died remained undisturbed. The sheets on the bed were neatly folded. There was no indentation in the mattress. The hearth had not been lit in weeks, and most damning, there was no smell. Ah, Poirot murmured to himself, a room without death, not even the ghost of it. In the wardrobe, a peculiar detail. Arthur's slippers were missing, but all his shoes remained. His walking cane was gone, though his boots were polished. Poirot said nothing at first. He only touched the cane hook, dustless, unlike the rest of the wood paneling. He turned to Hastings as they left the room. You see, mon ami, the man who dies does not walk out in his slippers, unless he was never truly dead. That evening, Poirot called a meeting of the household. Beatrice, Lionel, and Dr. Ambrose gathered in the drawing-room, the fireplace crackling and casting flickering shadows. Poirot remained standing, his hands gently clasped. There are 3 possibilities, he began. 1, the body was stolen, but there were no signs of disturbance in the ground, no broken seal on the casket, and no one observed anything unusual. 2, Arthur Brampton faked his own death. A bold scheme, but how and why? Or 3, someone replaced the body before burial. Beatrice gasped. But that would require planning, Poirot finished, resources and motive. He paced slowly. Arthur Brampton was wealthy, yes, but secretive. Perhaps he feared death, or perhaps he feared someone else. His wife, his brother, his doctor. I signed the death certificate, Dr. Ambrose said stiffly. I examined the body. But not the face, Poirot said quickly. The room was dark. You assumed a man in a shroud, cold and still. You trusted what you were told. Arthur had heart. Trouble? Yes, Poirot said. But the autopsy was never performed. Convenient. A heavy silence fell. Then Lionel chuckled. What are you suggesting, monsieur? That Arthur vanished into the night in his bathrobe? Poirot smiled slightly. Not a robe. Slippers. You're insane. Non, Poirot replied. I am merely observant. The first twist came the next morning. A telegram. Sent from Paris. Signed with Arthur's old cipher. A B. Impossible, Beatrice whispered, staring. At the paper. He's dead. Unless he was never buried, Poirot said. The second twist followed within hours. Poirot discovered that Arthur had withdrawn a large sum, £20,000, 3 days before his alleged death. Not from his estate, but from a hidden account under the name Albert Dawn, an alias. The trail led Poirot to an abandoned house by the sea. Inside, on the dusty table, a used teacup, still faintly warm, and a copy of the Times dated that very morning. But it wasn't until Poirot returned to Brampton House that he found what he needed. A second will, hidden behind a false panel in Arthur's study, dated the day before his supposed death, leaving everything not to Beatrice, but to Lionel. And now Act 3 could begin. That night, Poirot gathered them once more. The storm had returned, slashing rain against the windows as if trying to break in. Poirot stood, utterly still, in the center of the room. Arthur Brampton, he began, was a man who feared betrayal. From the beginning, he suspected that someone close wished to harm him. So he devised a test. He turned to Beatrice. You, madame, were the bait. He married you quickly, lavishly. You were meant to draw out the envy, the suspicion, the greed. She looked horrified. You think I married him for money? No, Poirot said. You married him for the stage. You gave up a promising career for security, and he knew it. Then to Lionel, and you, monsieur, you returned because you heard of the new will. He told you he wanted to see how far you would go. Lionel's expression cracked. He lied to me. Poirot's eyes burned with calm fury. Yes, because he wanted to know who among you would bury him alive. So he faked his death, disguised a different corpse, used his connections to vanish, and waited. Dr. Ambrose spoke at last. You believe he's still alive? Poirot nodded. Yes, and he will return, because he needs to see the conclusion of his experiment. But the will? Invalid, Poirot said. He revoked it. Everything will revert to the original beneficiary. And then from the hallway, footsteps, slow, heavy, familiar. Arthur Brampton entered, gaunt and pale, but very much alive. Beatrice fainted. Lionel took a step back, and Poirot, without turning, said quietly, The man who was never buried has returned. Later, as the rain faded and the silence returned, Hastings asked, Why? Why go to such lengths? Poirot stared at the fire. Because some men fear death less than they fear betrayal. Arthur Brampton needed to know which was stronger, love or greed. He picked up a single white envelope from the table. He has his answer. And as Wraithmore slept once more, the man who was never buried walked again among the living, no longer searching for safety, but for justice. Chapter 5. A name she swore never to speak. The mirror cracked on its own. No breeze touched it, no hand struck it. It simply split with a jagged sigh, as though the house itself could no longer bear the reflection it held. Beatrice Carrington stood motionless in her dressing room, the shards at her feet trembling, and whispered, almost to herself, "He's come back." The voice was not of fear, but something far colder, resignation. Poirot had been watching from the hallway, silent and still. As the sound reached him, to any other observer, it might have seemed the ramblings of a grieving widow haunted by past affection. But Poirot's mind, sharp as ever and intolerant of coincidence, tucked the phrase away like a knife sheathed for later use. "Ah," he mused inwardly, "so the lady sees ghosts, but only those she already knew." It had been 3 days since the death of Julian Roque, a once renowned composer who had returned to Wraithmore to settle what he called unfinished harmonies. He was found dead in the music room, his final score unfinished, the piano lid down and silent, and a single broken string curled like a noose on the floor. A glass of untouched absinthe sat beside him. No sign of violence, no sign of struggle. The local constable had called it suicide, but Poirot saw too much symmetry, too much arrangement. Death, when natural, is messy. This was curated. Beatrice Carrington, now Lady Carrington, was Julian's former muse, once the scandal of Paris when she fled the conservatory with him at age 19. The affair had burned bright and fast, ending in disgrace. She married into old money, reinvented herself, and never once spoke his name again. Not to her husband, not to her friends, not even in confession. But Poirot had seen her reaction at the funeral. The tremble in the veil, the smallest gasp when she looked into the coffin, the way she refused to let the casket be lowered until all the guests had departed. Grief does not hide, it writhes. Hers was different, controlled, cornered. She was not the only one with history buried at Wraithmore. Julian had come to stay at the home of Lydia Hulbrake, his cousin and former patroness, now a reclusive art collector with a peculiar fondness for tragic talent. It was she who discovered the body, and it was she who insisted on keeping the death private, discreet, almost shamefully quiet. Her manner overlooked the sea, like a mourning, widow's tower, and the tapestries whispered like they resented the living. Then there was Malcolm Heath, the estate's manager and Lydia's companion, though that word carried more ambiguity than affection. Tall, quiet, fastidious, a man who moved like a shadow with purpose. He was the last person known to speak with Julian alive, though he claimed it was only to deliver a telegram. Poirot began his inquiries that morning with Lydia. The house was still thick with the scent of lilies, though the windows had been opened. "Julian," she said, her voice low and guarded, was a troubled man, but he had his genius. I hoped, perhaps foolishly, that he might find peace here. Poirot studied her expression. "Mademoiselle, was it peace he sought, or forgiveness?" Her lips parted, but she said nothing. He noticed the tremble in her hand as she lifted her teacup, not the dominant hand. Her left burned faintly, not fresh, but recent. He said nothing yet. Poirot observed. He always observed. Beatrice refused to speak to him at first, locked behind her salon doors, surrounded by her oils and half-finished canvases. She dismissed his questions with curt disdain. "I haven't spoken to that man in 20 years. Why should I now?" "Because," Poirot said softly, "you whispered his name this morning. And mirrors do not break for strangers." She turned pale. You have 5 paintings in this room, he continued, all of them unfinished. All of them women facing away. All of them painted within the last month. All of them, madame, wear the same shade of blue, the color Julian once composed for in his concerto for Elise. That proves nothing, she snapped. It proves obsession, Poirot said calmly, or guilt. That night, Poirot stood in the music room, listening. The piano had not been tuned in years, yet it held a resonance, like something aching to be played. He touched the broken string. There was blood on it, not visible unless one looked closely. A small dot, not a wound from death, a finger cut, a struggle perhaps to finish one last note. He opened the piano lid. Beneath the keys, tucked deep into the mechanism, scraps of music, torn, half a composition, handwritten, and on the bottom corner, a name, Beatrice. Act 2 had begun. The next day, Poirot summoned Malcolm Heath. You say you delivered a telegram, and that Julian was alive when you left. Yes. What was his mood? Agitated, pacing. He said something strange. What was that? She'll never say it, not even if I die. Poirot leaned forward. And you assumed he meant? Malcolm looked away. Beatrice. Who else? Poirot smiled slightly. Who else? Indeed. It was the third evening when Poirot confronted Lydia again. This time, she was less composed. I burned the letter, she admitted, finally. Julian had written her, Beatrice, just before he died. It arrived the morning after he passed. I opened it. I read it. Then I burned it in the fireplace. Why? Poirot asked. Because it was cruel, Lydia whispered. It was his final act of punishment. He told her everything, that the last piece he wrote was for her, that he had never stopped loving her, that he blamed her for what he became. I couldn't let her read that. You thought you were protecting her. I thought I was ending it. Poirot nodded slowly. No, mademoiselle, you were only delaying the final note. The final act unfolded like a movement in a requiem. Poirot arranged a final gathering in the music room. Lydia, Malcolm, Beatrice. The unfinished score placed on the piano. The broken string replaced. The fire lit again. There was no suicide, Poirot began. Julian Roque was murdered. He had begun to speak truths, not just to Beatrice, but to others. He had seen the secrets in this house, and he had decided to expose them. His eyes met Lydia's. You feared he would ruin your name, that the family would be dragged through scandal. She looked away. Then to Malcolm. You delivered the telegram, but you also removed something from the room after Julian died. Not a letter, a cufflink. He blinked. I found it beneath the chaise, engraved with your initials, blood on the corner, a struggle, brief but sharp. Julian confronted you about something. What was it? Malcolm swallowed. He knew about the estate, about the funds Lydia gave me, quietly, privately. Poirot nodded. Blackmail, perhaps. Malcolm didn't answer. Finally, he turned to Beatrice. And you, madame, the one who never spoke his name. Why? Because it hurt? Because I killed him, she whispered. Silence fell like a curtain. I didn't mean to. He begged me to come, said he would reveal everything, said he would tell my husband, my son. I met him that night. We argued. He reached for me. I pushed him. He fell, hit his head. Poirot closed his eyes. You burned his letter too. Yes. Then why say it now? Her eyes glistened. Because you made me remember he once called me his voice. And now I'm the silence. Poirot stood. Truth, madame, is not a matter of courage. It is a matter of time. And yours, at last, has spoken. That night, as Wraithmore fell into stillness once more, Poirot walked alone beside the sea. Hastings joined him quietly. She killed him, Hastings said. And yet, I don't hate her. Poirot nodded. It is the tragedy of the human heart, mon ami. We bury the names that hurt us, but they do not stay buried. One day, they whisper. One day, they scream. He looked out over the black waves. And sometimes, if one listens closely enough, one can hear them begging to be spoken. Chapter 6. The ring that didn't fit her finger. The scream that shattered the stillness of Wraithmore Hall was not loud, but it was final. Sharp, sudden, and strangled at the edges. It came from the bridal suite, where Eleanor St. James had been dressing for the engagement dinner. By the time Poirot arrived, summoned not by panic but by precision, she stood like a statue before the cheval mirror, her face white, her eyes wide and unblinking. On her ring finger sat the engagement band, blood-red ruby set in a platinum coil. But it was too large, loose. It spun easily, unnaturally, and she was trembling. It doesn't fit, she whispered, more to her reflection than to the room. It's not mine. It was never mine. Poirot stepped forward slowly, the thick carpet muffling his footsteps. Mademoiselle, he said gently, who told you that? Her gaze didn't move. The man who gave it to me is dead, and still, someone else wants it back. Outside, the sky brooded over the moors, and the wind traced icy fingers along the windows. Inside, a storm of its own had already begun to rise. The ruby glinted like a drop of clotting blood on her pale skin, and Poirot's sharp eyes noted what others would dismiss. The way her hand hovered away from her body, the discoloration on the lower knuckle, the faint indentation on the other hand, the right. Ah, but human nature, Hastings, it never changes. A lie, even one wrapped in sentiment, always leaves a bruise. The engagement was to Philip Aberley, heir to a shipping fortune, cold-blooded in business, impeccably polite in company. He had been found that morning, face down in the study, struck dead with a paperweight, the one that had rested for years on his grandfather's desk. The same paperweight, Poirot now noted, was curiously free of bloodstains, its edges wiped clean, yet resting askew on a smear of ink and something far more telling. Dust disturbed in a rectangular shape. Box had been taken. A ring box, perhaps. The family had gathered under strained civility. Eleanor, the grieving fiancée, with eyes like haunted glass. Isabel Aberley, Philip's younger sister, fiercely intelligent and barely restrained by etiquette. Mr. Howard Linden, Philip's solicitor and childhood friend, now executor of what was to be a vast fortune. And lastly, Mrs. Helena Aberley, the matriarch, frail in appearance, steel beneath. Poirot began his inquiries with the ring. When did Philip give this to you, mademoiselle? 3 days ago, Eleanor said softly. But he said it had belonged to someone else, someone from long ago. It was complicated. Ah, Poirot murmured. Complicated. That most dangerous of words. In the study, Poirot crouched beside the fireplace, inspecting the grate. A faint trace of ash. Too recent, too grey. Not firewood. Paper. Something had been burned. Beside it, the poker, used, but not for stirring flames. Its handle bore a smudge, powder, possibly from a glove. Poirot smiled inwardly. Not a crime of passion. No, a crime of planning. In the drawing room, Poirot questioned Isabelle Aberley. "My brother was not a kind man," she said plainly. "I didn't like him, but I didn't kill him, if that's what you're asking." "Not yet," Poirot said, "but we will come to that." He gestured to her book, The Symbolism of Rings in European History. A curious choice of reading in such a time. "I'm writing a thesis on grief, on control," she replied, "which is often mistaken for love." Poirot inclined his head. "And your brother? He controlled Eleanor?" Isabelle's gaze sharpened. She would never admit it, but yes. "Why do you think she accepted his proposal?" "Because it was safer than refusing." Poirot considered this. Safer for whom? Isabelle said nothing. Next, Poirot approached Mr. Linden. The solicitor stood at the window, watching the trees sway under the wind. "You were to witness the signing of a new will?" Poirot asked. "Yes, this morning." Philip intended to amend the terms. To favor Eleanor? Partially, but also to disinherit someone quietly. Poirot leaned closer. "And whom, monsieur, did he intend to cut out?" Linden hesitated. "Isabelle." "Ah, because of her opinions?" "Because she found out something he wished to keep buried." Poirot's eyes narrowed. "And what was that?" Linden looked down. "That the ring was not an heirloom. It was a token from a woman Philip was once engaged to, a woman who disappeared." Poirot's voice was silk. "And was this woman's name Claire Aberley?" Linden's shoulders stiffened. "She was a cousin, not by blood. They were engaged 5 years ago. The engagement ended abruptly. She vanished. The family never spoke of her again." "Because they were ashamed?" "No, because they were afraid." Poirot found Eleanor in the rose garden just before dusk. She held her hand over her heart, the ring glinting in the waning light. "He said it had been cursed," she whispered, "that anyone who wore it without love would suffer." Poirot paused. "And you, mademoiselle, do you love him?" Her silence was the only answer he needed. Act 2 came to a crescendo with the arrival of a stranger. A man, damp from travel, his face partially hidden by a scarf. He presented himself as a traveler in need of shelter from the storm. But Poirot recognized the gait, the way he favored his left foot. He had seen it once before, in a photograph half burned in a fireplace, a photograph of Claire Aberley's last known lover. The man called himself Mr. Bellamy, but Poirot saw past the name. Late that night, Poirot gathered them all in the music room, always the room with the clearest acoustics. Eleanor, Isabelle, Mrs. Aberley, Linden, and Mr. Bellamy. The storm clashed against the windows, like a hand trying to break in. "It is a tale," Poirot began, "of mistaken identity, of obsession, and of a ring that was never meant to be worn by the woman who received it." He gestured toward Eleanor. "This ring, mademoiselle, was not a gift of love. It was a symbol of control, but it did not belong to you." She looked down. "I know." Poirot turned to Isabelle. "You resented him, but you did not kill him. You uncovered a truth, yes, but you intended to expose it through legal means." She nodded. "Mr. Linden," Poirot continued, "you knew the truth about Claire, that she was pregnant, that Philip planned to send her away, and when she vanished, you suspected foul play." "Yes," he said quietly, "but I had no proof." Poirot looked at the man in the scarf. "And you, monsieur, Your real name is Thomas Bellamy. You were Claire's fiancé before Philip intervened. You searched for her for 5 years, and only recently you received a letter, not from Claire, but from Eleanor. Gasps rippled through the room. Eleanor stepped back. I found the letters, she said, in Philip's desk. She wrote him every week, pleading, begging. He never responded. I didn't know what else to do. And so, Poirot said, you called the ghost back to the house. Thomas looked up, eyes wet. I came to see if it was true, if he'd really kept her somewhere. Poirot closed his eyes. He had. The well on the far side of the estate, covered, dry. Her remains were discovered by the groundskeeper this morning. He thought they were animal bones. They were not. Silence fell, heavy, immovable. Poirot took the ring from Eleanor's hand and held it up. This, he said, was hers. It never belonged to you. It never belonged to him. It belonged to the woman whose name this house tried to erase. He handed it to Thomas. Return it to her. Let her rest. Eleanor wept. Isabel turned away. The storm passed. Later, Hastings asked Poirot, will anyone be punished? Poirot stared into the fire. Perhaps not by law, but by memory, yes. This house will remember. He rose slowly. There are some rings, mon ami, that do not bind love, but chains, and the finger that wears it knows, even before the heart admits it, when it does not belong. The ruby ring sat alone on the mantel, catching the firelight one final time, its gleam no longer brilliant, but hollow, like a promise unkept, like a love betrayed. Chapter 7. A window, locked from the outside. The first thing she noticed were the footprints in the frost. They trailed beneath her bedroom window, perfectly shaped, deliberate, and leading nowhere. Eleanor Lee stood barefoot on the stone floor, staring at the pale glass pane that separated her from the frozen garden below. There were no cracks, no sign of forced entry, no curtain drawn aside. And yet someone had been there. Someone had watched her while she slept. Poirot arrived, an hour later, summoned not by a telegram, but by a whisper, a letter unsigned, scented faintly of rosewater and fear, delivered by hand to his lodgings in Paddington. Please come before he returns. That was all it said. It was enough. Ashcombe Manor stood high on the edge of the coastal moor, all gables and chimneys and shuttered windows that blinked like suspicious eyes. The storm had passed, but the skies above it remained the color of old bruises, and the air inside was colder than it had any right to be. Poirot stepped into the drawing room as Eleanor poured tea with hands that refused to stop trembling. I locked the window myself, she insisted, eyes wide and rimmed with sleeplessness. I always do. Every night. I check it 3 times. But when I woke, it was still locked from the outside. Poirot said nothing at first. His gaze swept the room not for danger, but for absence. A flower out of water. A mirror not dusted. A chair pushed slightly too far from the table. The details, whispered. He always listened. Eleanor Lee was 28, recently returned from Vienna after the death of her husband. Her mourning was elegant, tasteful, and performed with just enough restraint to appear genuine. She had inherited Ashcombe only 3 months ago. Since then, there had been incidents, footsteps in the corridor, doors opening in the night, the feeling of being watched, but this was the first physical evidence. The footprints were not yours, Poirot asked softly. No, I haven't been outside in days. You saw no one? No, but I felt it. I knew someone was there. Poirot lifted his hand. We must be precise, mademoiselle. A window that locks from the outside. This is unusual. It was reinforced last year. After a break-in attempt, my late husband had it done. A custom latch. Then we are dealing with someone who knows the house well. 3 suspects emerged within the hour. First, Daniel Armitage, the groundskeeper's son, a former soldier turned handyman, quiet, observant, and often seen lurking where he shouldn't be. He had grown up at Ashcombe and knew every inch of the estate. He said little, but Poirot watched the way his eyes avoided Eleanor. Second was Miriam Halberd, the companion. Once a governess, now employed to keep Eleanor company, though there was nothing warm in her gaze. She carried an air of calculation behind her courtesy. Poirot noticed her. Fingers were stained faintly with charcoal, not from writing, but from the sketch-pad she kept hidden in her chamber. She drew at night, observing, capturing, remembering. Lastly, Julian Delcroft, the cousin. Orphaned young, he had grown up with Eleanor and had only recently returned from South Africa. His inheritance had vanished through failed ventures. His return, Poirot noted, came just after the solicitor revised Eleanor's will. Coincidence is the refuge of the uncurious. Poirot never took refuge. That night, Poirot walked the perimeter of the manor. The frost still clung to the grass, and the footprints remained. Too perfect, too staged. He followed them to the corner of the house, where they stopped beneath the copper drain pipe. The pipe had been loosened, just enough to hold a hand. He re-entered the house and examined the latch from inside. Complex, but not impossible. He tested a theory with a length of twine and a bent hairpin. Less than 4 minutes. A man with precision could lock it from outside. In the hallway, Poirot paused before a painting. A portrait of Eleanor's late husband, Charles Lee, austere, expressionless. The kind of man who kept secrets because he could not bear questions. Poirot turned to Eleanor. You loved him? Her voice was paper-thin. I don't know. Then perhaps, mademoiselle, you feared him. In the days that followed, the house grew colder. Eleanor awoke again to find her curtains drawn, though she had closed them. Her lamp was moved. A necklace once kept in her drawer was found resting on her pillow. The message was not theft. It was presence. Poirot questioned Daniel first. You were seen near the west wing at midnight, Poirot said. I was fixing the boiler pipe, Daniel replied. Ask the housekeeper. She heard the rattle. And the footprints? I didn't make them, but I saw them. They were fresh, too fresh. Planted. By whom? Daniel looked at the floor. Someone who wants her to think she's going mad. Next Miriam, Poirot found her in the conservatory, sketching ivy. You sleep lightly, no? He asked. Yes. You hear things others don't. Yes. Then why did you not report the sounds in the corridor last week? She looked up. Because I thought it was her. You mean Eleanor? Yes. Why? Because she talks in her sleep. Walks, sometimes. Once I found her in the library at 2 a.m., staring at the fireplace. She didn't remember. Did you tell anyone? No, it felt cruel. Poirot nodded. Kindness that conceals is often worse than cruelty that reveals. Then Julian. You were close once, Poirot said. We were children. But she wrote to you. Often. Her letters, affectionate. He smiled. childish affection. And yet you came back. She was alone. I worried. Poirot looked him dead in the eyes. And you knew her husband hated you. Julian's jaw tightened. Act 2 ended with a letter, delivered in the middle of the night. No sender. Just a single sentence. She does not belong here. She never did. Poirot gathered them all the following evening in the drawing room. The storm had returned, lightning splitting the sky like a warning. The truth, Poirot said, is not in the footprints. It is in the intention. This was not a break-in. This was a theater, designed to create fear. He turned to Miriam. You heard the creak of the boards. You drew them. I found the sketch, the window, the bed, the figure outside. You knew. She looked away. To protect her, or yourself? She's fragile. No, she is not fragile. She is lied to. He turned to Julian. You found the old letters. Eleanor's first marriage was not loving. It was a contract, one of control. You knew she inherited everything. You resented it. But you didn't kill her husband. You waited. You returned. Julian didn't deny it. But you miscalculated, Poirot continued. Because someone else already lived in fear of being found out. He turned at last to Daniel. It was you, not out of hatred, but protection. Charles Lee discovered your secret, that you are not Daniel Armitage's son. You are Charles's illegitimate child. Gasps rippled. You learned the truth through a letter your mother left. Charles dismissed you, but when he died, you returned. You did not hurt Eleanor. You watched her, protected her. The window, locked from outside, was you. Daniel stood, pale. He beat her. You didn't know. I saw it. I couldn't stop it then, but I could now. Poirot nodded slowly. And you tried to scare her into leaving, so she would not repeat the same cycle. But fear is not salvation. It is only a different kind of prison. Eleanor stepped forward. Why didn't you say something? Daniel's voice broke. Because I didn't think I had the right. The silence that followed was heavy, earned. Poirot turned to the fire. Sometimes, he said softly, the most terrifying thing is not what enters a room, but what watches it silently from outside, waiting for permission to help and never receiving it. As the storm died, so too did the illusion. And at Ashcombe Manor, the truth, at last, was allowed to sleep. Chapter 8. The shadow at her husband's wake. The first candle flickered violently, as if gasping for breath, and then extinguished itself. The second followed without warning, plunging the eastern wing of Elmcroft Hall into sudden darkness. There were no footsteps, no creaking doors, just a silence, too absolute to be natural. Then came the gasp, not loud, not panicked, but shivering with disbelief. Mrs. Genevieve Morton stood in the drawing-room beside her husband's open casket, staring toward the archway at the far end of the hall. Her hand, holding a black handkerchief, trembled violently. He's there, she whispered. He's standing there. 3 guests turned their heads in time to see the tall figure vanish behind the curtain, the same figure now lying cold in the coffin. Within seconds, the room erupted in gasps, overturned chairs, and the frantic hiss of whispers. By the time Hercule Poirot arrived that evening, the house was sealed, the storm had begun, and everyone was already doubting what they had seen. But Poirot did not. He never dismissed the impossible, only the improbable. 3 witnesses, he murmured, stepping past the casket. 1 widow, 2 friends, all swear, The dead man walked. He bent low and examined the body with delicate care. Charles Morton, age 63, successful banker, well-respected, and recently deceased of what the physician had ruled heart failure. The skin was pale, the features serene. But something was wrong. Poirot noticed the collar was buttoned too tightly for comfort, an attempt to conceal bruising, or something worse. Genevieve Morton sat in a high-backed chair near the fire, staring blankly into the flames. She was 35, beautiful in a quiet, serious way, and dressed in elegant mourning. Her voice was low and brittle. "It was him," she said. "Not a shadow. Not a trick of the candle. It was Charles. I saw him watching me." Poirot nodded once. "And before this moment, madame, had you ever believed in ghosts?" She turned to him, startled. "Never. Then let us suppose for a moment that you still do not. Someone made you believe he had returned. Why?" The guests included Dr. Lionel Farnsworth, a family friend, and Charles Morton's physician of over 20 years, Miss Clarice Hilling, Genevieve's childhood companion, now employed as a housekeeper and occasional confidant, and Mr. Edmund Cross, Charles's business partner, sharp of tongue, cynical of soul, and too quick to laugh. Poirot questioned them one by one, his manner courteous but exact. "I pronounced him dead myself," Dr. Farnsworth said. "I found him in the study, collapsed beside the fireplace. There were no signs of trauma." "Did you perform a post-mortem?" Poirot asked. The doctor hesitated. "No. His heart condition was well known." Poirot's eyes narrowed. "Sometimes what is known blinds us to what is true." Clarice Hilling admitted she had been the first to light the candles in the drawing room and was the one to notice the extinguished flame. "I thought it was the wind," she said nervously, "but the windows were shut. Then I saw Genevieve staring, and I turned, and I saw him." Poirot noted her gloved hands. "You are cold." "Non, monsieur. I have eczema. The gloves are to protect them." Poirot nodded, but he remembered the ash on her gloves. Faint, soft. From what fire? Mr. Cross was amused by the entire affair. "Ghosts and shadows," he said, lighting a cigarette with a silver matchstick. "Frankly, I wouldn't put it past Charles to fake his death just to watch us squirm." The man loved drama. Poirot raised a brow. "But he is, regrettably, very much dead. I've buried worse business partners." "Indeed. But were they watching you from the curtains?" Cross smiled. "If he was watching me, he was jealous. I'm the one who got the final deal." "Ah," Poirot said. "And what deal was that?" "The South African shares, worth a small fortune. Charles left them to me." Poirot said nothing, but he noted the smirk. Greed, after all, often wears confidence as a mask. Act 2 began with a lie. Poirot requested to see the will. Genevieve produced it from a locked cabinet. It was dated 6 months prior. It left the majority of the estate to her, but included a codicil added 2 weeks ago. The codicil named Edmund Cross as co-beneficiary of a new investment fund that had not yet been made public. "The ink," Poirot noted, "is quite fresh." "I assure you," Genevieve said, "it was added by Charles himself." "But there are no fingerprints on the parchment, only yours. I handled it just before you arrived." "Of course." Poirot wandered the house that evening, paying particular attention to the study. The hearth was cold, but the ashtray nearby contained 3 half-burned cigarillos. Charles Morton had never smoked. Edmund Cross, however, did. Carpet showed signs of something heavy being dragged, then lifted. Poirot followed the faint impressions to the corner bookshelf. Behind it, nothing. But Poirot paused. "Ah," he said softly, "it is not the things we find, Hastings. It is the places where we find nothing at all." The second twist came when Poirot asked for the mortuary log. Dr. Farnsworth hesitated, then admitted the body had never actually left Elmcroft Hall. There was difficulty arranging transport, he claimed. Genevieve wished him to remain at home until burial. And so the body was never examined by a third party. No. Then how do we know it is truly Charles Morton in that casket? The room went silent. Poirot demanded the casket be opened again. The body was there, cold, still, identifiable. And yet, Poirot looked closer. The scar above the temple. Charles's boxing injury from youth. It was missing. "This is not the man in the photographs." Genevieve fainted. Act 3. Moved swiftly. Poirot gathered them all in the drawing room. Once more before the casket, once more in the flickering light of the same candles. "You saw a ghost," he said softly, "but not from the grave, from the corridor." He turned to Clarice. "You knew Charles had a brother. One no one spoke of, a twin." Clarice paled. "How did you—" "The letters in your desk. You corresponded with him for years. He was ill. You were the only one who cared." Poirot turned to the others. "Arthur Morton, committed to a sanitarium at 19, declared unstable, hidden by the family, but he returned 2 weeks ago, and he saw Genevieve, and he remembered." Poirot stepped to the casket. "This man is Arthur Morton, not Charles." Gasps broke out. Poirot continued. "Charles killed his brother, possibly by accident, possibly not. Then, with Dr. Farnsworth's help, he staged his own death using Arthur's body." He turned to the doctor. "You were paid to falsify the death. And Cross, you were promised the shares if you played along." Cross swore. "I didn't know." Poirot silenced him. But something changed. Charles intended to disappear, but someone betrayed him. Someone turned the plan against him, and that someone was Genevieve. All eyes turned. "Yes," Poirot said. "You knew. You found Charles hiding. You confronted him. He threatened you. You struck him with the paperweight. And then you made sure the ghost appeared so no one would ask the wrong questions." Genevieve stood slowly. "He was going to leave me with nothing." Poirot nodded. "And instead, you buried his brother in his place." The silence that followed was absolute. Later, Poirot stood outside beneath the grey sky. Hastings approached. "You knew from the beginning?" "I knew," Poirot said, "that no man attends his own wake, but it is always the shadow behind the living that casts the darkest light." He looked back at the house. "Justice, mon ami, is not just for the dead. It is for those who bury the truth with them." And inside Elmcroft Hall, the candles finally flickered out, for the right man, at last. Chapter 9. The Maid Who Vanished with the Truth. She knew the widow's secret, and the price it demanded. The note was left on the tray, folded beneath the teacup like an afterthought. The porcelain trembled faintly as Poirot picked it up, as if even the china had sensed something unnatural. There were no fingerprints on the silver, no crumbs on the plate, just one line, written in a hurried looping scrawl. She knew too much. Poirot stared at the words for a long moment, the steam from the tea curling around his moustache like a ghost. "Ah," he murmured. "The maid, she is not late, Hastings. She is missing. 3 nights prior, the household of Langford Grange had gathered to mourn the sudden death of Reginald Langford, a former shipping magnate and the master of the estate. He had died quietly in his study, alone, it was said, of a sudden seizure brought on by stress, or so the doctor claimed. But the maid, Violet Ems, had not returned to her room that night, nor had she been seen since. No carriage tracks, no torn letters, no stolen jewels. Just an absence, a quiet vanishing that echoed louder with each passing hour. The widow, Eleanor Langford, had worn her grief with the grace of an actress in mourning black. Her eyes welled at precisely the right moments. Her sighs were soft but audible, and yet Poirot watched her not as a grieving wife, but as a woman too composed. The widow, he thought, is like the swan. On the surface, elegant. Beneath, chaos. But in this case, perhaps there is no paddling at all. Only calculation. Eleanor insisted Violet must have run off. She was always dramatic, she said. Threatened to leave on several occasions. She fancied herself above her station, you know. Thought she had secrets no one else did. I suppose she wanted to be missed. Poirot tilted his head gently. Madame, perhaps she did not wish to be missed. Perhaps she merely wished to survive. 3 suspects emerged quickly. The first, Charles Haddon, Eleanor's brother, a man with polished shoes and unpolished intentions. A gambler by nature, he had returned to the manor the night of Reginald's death, claiming only to offer condolences. But Poirot noted his wristwatch was still set to Monte Carlo time, and his coat reeked faintly of cologne and smoke. When asked about Violet, he said, "She was a flirt, always watching, always listening. It wouldn't surprise me if she'd blackmailed someone and then slipped off to Paris with the winnings." He said it too easily. Second was Nurse Evelyn Ridge, recently hired to tend to Reginald's failing health, a quiet woman with severe features and a knack for blending into the wallpaper. She had been in the room moments after Reginald's death, yet her account changed slightly each time she spoke. First, she had found him slumped at the desk, then later, she claimed he was by the fireplace. Poirot questioned her about Violet. She was nervous, Evelyn admitted. Kept glancing at Mrs. Langford, like she was afraid. I think she saw something, but when I asked, she just smiled, said the truth was buried too deep. The third was Eleanor herself, a former actress turned society wife. Eleanor had a face trained in performance and a voice designed to disarm. She insisted Violet had no enemies, that Reginald had died of natural causes. That grief came in waves. But Poirot, ever attuned to the rhythms of human deception, saw the way her hand trembled, not when she spoke of her husband, but when she saw the note. Poirot walked the halls of Langford Grange that evening, with careful steps. The storm outside beat against the windows in waves, and the lamps flickered with each gust of wind. He studied the study, Reginald's final room, and noted something peculiar. The books on the shelf behind the desk were arranged not by subject or author, but by height. All except one, a slim volume on Mediterranean poisons. It had been pulled out half an inch farther than the others, not by accident. Belladonna, Poirot muttered. Untraceable in the right dose, but in the wrong hands, quite fatal. He returned to Violet's small attic room. It had not been disturbed. Her uniform hung on the back of the door. Her mirror was clean. But on the nightstand, tucked beneath a lace cloth, Poirot found a tiny scrap of a torn photograph. Reginald, younger, standing beside a woman who was most definitely not Eleanor, a signature in the corner, to Violet, with love. The next morning, Poirot requested all 3 suspects remain in the manor. "We are dealing not with one crime," he announced, "but 2. The murder of Reginald Langford and the silencing of Violet Ems." Hastings leaned in. "Do you think she's still alive?" Poirot's eyes darkened. "I think she was, until she told someone what she knew." He assembled the suspects in the drawing room. The rain outside had become a curtain. Thunder rolled across the hills like a distant drum. "Let us begin with you, Monsieur Haddon," Poirot said. "You arrived the night of the death, yes? But not for grief, for leverage. You had debts, many, and your brother-in-law had recently changed his will to cut you out entirely." Charles swallowed. "How do you—" "I found the letter in your luggage," Poirot said smoothly. "You had intended to confront him, but you arrived too late, or rather, just in time, to see someone else leave the study in haste." Poirot turned to Nurse Ridge. "Mademoiselle, your duty was to protect your patient, but you were in the corridor when Violet entered the study that evening, were you not?" Evelyn nodded slowly. "Yes. She had something. A letter, maybe." She looked terrified. She was going to give it to him. Poirot stepped forward. "But she never did. Because someone else interrupted. Someone who knew the cost of exposure." He turned to Eleanor. "Madame Langford, Violet was your daughter." A gasp swept the room. Poirot continued gently. "You were very young. It was before your marriage. Reginald adopted her into service when she turned 16, but he never revealed the truth to anyone." Eleanor's voice was cold. "She was a scandal I could not afford." Poirot nodded. "And yet, she threatened to reveal it. That night, not for money, but for recognition, for a name. She had found the birth certificate. I found it too, in her drawer. She wanted to stand beside you, not below." Eleanor's eyes did not blink. She would have destroyed everything. Poirot took a slow breath. "So you poisoned Reginald, not for hate, but because he refused to protect your secret anymore. He had decided to acknowledge Violet in his new will, to give her a portion of the estate. You couldn't allow that." The silence that followed was deeper than before, almost reverent. Hastings whispered, "So Violet's gone?" Poirot shook his head. "No, she is not gone." He walked to the side door, opened it, and there, stepping into the room, drenched in rain but alive, was Violet Ems. Eleanor staggered backward. Poirot smiled, faintly. "She ran. Yes, but she ran to me. The note on the tray, it was not hers, it was yours. A lie, written to frame her, to silence her memory before it could speak." Violet's voice was trembling. "I didn't want money, just to be seen." Poirot placed a hand on her shoulder. "And now, mademoiselle, you are." As Eleanor Langford was taken away by the constables, the storm finally broke. The sun pierced the clouds in slivers, casting long shadows across the old floorboards. Poirot watched them, hands folded, eyes solemn. "There are crimes," he said softly, "that kill the body, and there are crimes that kill the name. But to erase a truth, that, mon ami, is the cruelest murder of all." Chapter 10. A lie, written in mourning ink. It looked like a condolence. It read like a confession. The letter was still damp when Poirot unfolded it, and the ink had bled at the edges like tears that had tried too hard to look sincere. It arrived without return address, pressed into a black-edged envelope, the kind reserved for death notices and whispered regrets. To the grieving family, it began, and yet Poirot's fingers paused halfway down the page. There it was, buried in a flourish of false sympathy, a single line that did not grieve but confessed. I did not mean for him to die, but secrets rot the soul, and mine is too full already. He read it again, and then he folded the letter back into its envelope and slipped it into the pocket of his waistcoat as the train to Hawthorne-on-Sea rocked gently beneath him. Outside, a pale sky hung over the countryside like a shroud, and the smoke from the engine curled like a black ribbon across the moors. Poirot's mind was already racing, faster than the wheels beneath him. A condolence that mourns too neatly is rarely written by the innocent. Ah, but human nature, Hastings, it always reveals itself in ink. The murder of Horace Fenley, retired barrister and patriarch of the Fenley estate, had been declared sudden but suspicious. A solitary man, once feared in courtrooms and now merely avoided in drawing rooms, Horace was found slumped over his writing desk with a pen still in hand and a half-finished note addressed to my daughter, Imogen. The ink had run dry mid-sentence. At first, it was thought a stroke, but the coroner found traces of belladonna, administered with precision and in silence. When Poirot arrived at Fenley Manor, it stood under a heavy sky, its dark windows watching the world with suspicion. The housekeeper, Mrs. Allen, greeted him with a stiffness bordering on hostility. "Another detective," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "The inspector said it was poisoning, said it was someone close. Well, we've no shortage of those." Inside, time seemed to slow. The ticking of clocks filled the halls like a heartbeat. Poirot observed everything. The way the hallway runner was just slightly misaligned, the faint scent of pipe tobacco lingering near the back stairs, the water stains beneath the library decanter. It was not the house of grief, but of something colder. Fear, perhaps, or guilt that had learned how to keep quiet. Horace's daughter, Imogen Fenley, was the first to speak with Poirot. She was tall, pale, and dressed in widow's black, though she had never married. Her face bore a kind of elegant detachment, as if mourning were something to be studied from a distance. "Father was difficult," she said, standing near the fireplace, "but he was mine. He did not deserve this." Poirot inclined his head. "Mademoiselle, may I inquire what was your father writing when he died?" Imogen's eyes flickered. "I don't know. I never saw the note. The constable said it was incoherent." Poirot smiled faintly. "And yet he began it with your name." Her mouth opened slightly, but no words came. Just a soft exhale, like a candle flickering out. The second suspect was Edward Lytton, the family solicitor, and a man whose politeness was so perfect it drew suspicion. He walked Poirot through the family finances with mechanical precision, pausing only once, when Poirot asked about the will. "It was updated last month," Lytton said. "Horace left the majority of his estate to Imogen, of course, but there was a new clause, an annuity for a woman named Esther Vale." "Ah?" Poirot's brow rose. "And who is this mysterious lady?" "She was an old acquaintance from Horace's past." But Poirot had already seen the photograph tucked behind the curtain rod in Horace's study, a woman with dark eyes and a scar above her lip, a wartime nurse, based on the uniform. The back read, "Evdash saved my life once. Now I must return the favor." The third was Mrs. Allen herself. Devoted, yes, but her loathing for Horace was poorly disguised. "He was cruel," she muttered to Poirot, That night in the kitchen, not physically, but cruel in his bones, he said things you can't take back, things that crawl inside your head. But I didn't kill him, if that's what you're thinking. I think only what the facts suggest, Poirot replied. And facts, madame, do not speak with passion. They whisper with precision. That night, Poirot examined the letter again, under the glow of his reading lamp. The morning ink had dried into spider-thin veins. He held it close, his eyes tracing the loops of each letter. There, on the final curve of the word, already, a blotch. Not an accident, but a tear. Someone had cried while writing this. Someone torn between guilt and secrecy. Poirot thought the ink was black, but the emotion was red. He returned to the study. The fire had long died. In the grate, he found ashes, but not all were paper. Among the embers, a cufflink, gold, monogrammed. Not Horace's. It belonged to Edward Lytton. The next morning, Poirot summoned them all. "Mes amis," he began, "this house has long lived in silence, but silence is never empty. It hides, it preserves, and when one looks closely, very closely, it betrays." He turned to Imogen. "Your father died writing you a final note, a letter that might have revealed everything. But someone panicked, someone intercepted it, someone wrote a false condolence to throw us off the scent, but revealed too much." Imogen's face had gone white. Poirot held up the letter. This was not penned by a grieving friend. It was written by someone inside this house, someone who knew Horace's secrets, and whose hand trembled as they wrote. He turned to Lytton. "Monsieur, your cufflink was found in the grate. You burned something the night Horace died." Lytton's voice broke. "I burned nothing." Poirot nodded. "Yes, you did, but not the note. You burned a legal document, one that proved Horace was about to disinherit Imogen in favor of Esther Vale." Imogen gasped. "That's not possible." "Oh, but it is," Poirot said gently, "because Esther Vale was your mother." Silence, thick, stifling. Poirot's voice softened. "Horace never acknowledged you, not truly. He took you in, yes, but not out of love, out of shame. It was Edward Lytton who discovered the truth, and when Horace refused to make it public, Edward, who loved you like a daughter, acted." Lytton slumped. "I only meant to frighten him, to poison just enough to make him reconsider, but he drank the entire glass." Poirot walked toward the fire. "And when you found him dead, you panicked. You wrote this letter to throw suspicion elsewhere, a condolence that became a confession. But the ink, it does not lie." Imogen stared at Lytton, horrified. "You poisoned him. For me." His voice cracked. "For justice. For what he took from both of you." Poirot said nothing more. Outside, the wind began to howl, and as the constables led Lytton away, Poirot remained by the fireplace, hands folded. Hastings approached. "What do you make of it, Poirot?" Poirot looked at the dying embers. "There are lies that scream," he said, "and there are lies that whisper from behind ink and ash. But all lies, mon ami, eventually smudge." Chapter 11. The Garden Where She Hid the Gun. The roses bloomed red, but they weren't always flowers. The gardener's spade struck something hard beneath the soil, and he froze. It was not a root nor stone. It made a hollow metallic thud. The morning mist curled over the flower beds like breath from a corpse, and the roses stood too proud for a day that followed a murder. The man knelt slowly, pushing back the rich red earth with nervous hands. When the cold metal emerged from the ground, slick with dew and dirt. He dropped the spade with a yelp. "Monsieur Poirot," he shouted toward the house, "there's something in the rose bed. It's a gun." And in that moment, Hercule Poirot, standing on the stone path with hands behind his back, eyes sharp beneath a tilted bowler hat, turned very slowly. "Ah," he said softly. "Then the garden. She speaks." The events of the previous evening still trembled in the walls of Rosewood Hall. The death of Lionel Marchbanks, the reclusive former magistrate and owner of the estate, had sent shockwaves through the countryside. A single shot, fired just after midnight, had shattered the calm of a stormless night. The butler had found him slumped in his study chair, a bullet through his chest, his eyes wide and staring at the fireplace. No weapon had been found, no signs of forced entry. But one thing was certain. The killer had been inside the house. Poirot had arrived only hours before the murder, having been invited under curious circumstances by Lionel himself. A letter, trembling with unease, had requested the detective's presence for a matter of the gravest personal threat. But by the time Poirot stepped onto the marble threshold, the threat had already become reality. So often, Poirot mused to Hastings that morning, the client is dead before the truth may be spoken. And so, we must let the silence speak in his place. Inside the grand home, shadows clung to the drapes like secrets. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the foyer felt too loud, too urgent. Poirot observed each resident with an eye sharpened by decades of deception. They all wept for Lionel, some with guilt, some with fury, and one with nothing at all. There was Alicia Marchbanks, Lionel's niece and ward, who had returned to Rosewood after years abroad. A painter by trade, she was known for her quiet rebellion. Her scarlet lips and whisper-thin cigarette holder seemed to defy the house's conservative bones. "He raised me," she had told Poirot coolly, "but never let me forget it was charity. I loved him, but I also hated him." Her eyes didn't flinch when she said it, but Poirot noticed how her fingers, so steady with a brush, trembled when offered tea. Then there was Dr. Gideon Bellamy, a local physician and friend to Lionel for 20 years. Tall, thin, with a voice as smooth as mercury. "I warned him," Bellamy muttered, standing over Lionel's body. His heart could not withstand another trial, but he insisted. He was to change his will tonight, said he wished to make things right. Poirot nodded. "And who, monsieur, might he have wronged?" Bellamy's mouth twitched. "You'll find, monsieur, that everyone here believes it was them." Third was Mrs. Beatrix Langford, the housekeeper for over 30 years, whose loyalty to Lionel was nearly religious. She wore mourning black before the body was even cold. "He was a just man," she said to Poirot, her voice taut. "But even the just can have enemies, especially among the ungrateful." She glanced toward Alicia as she said it. Poirot raised a brow, gently. "It is curious," he later told Hastings, "that the housekeeper mourns like a widow and the ward like a guest." The discovery of the gun in the garden changed everything. It was old, perhaps World War I issue, still warm beneath the layers of earth. Poirot knelt beside it, examining the red clay clinging to the barrel. "She buried it, too carefully," he murmured. "But not carefully enough. The earth, she remembers, even if people forget." That afternoon, Poirot summoned the household to the drawing room. Light poured through the stained glass windows in fractured hues, splashing red across the Persian rug where Lionel once sat. Poirot paced slowly, his footsteps soft, but the silence heavier than boots. Monsieur Marchbanks, he began, was shot with a weapon of personal proximity. The angle of entry, the powder, burn. These suggest someone stood close, too close for a stranger. This was not an intruder. This was an execution. Alicia's cigarette snapped in half between her fingers. Poirot continued. And yet, no weapon was found. No trace, until the roses gave up their secret. A gun, buried in haste, wrapped in a lace handkerchief. Beatrix Langford made a strangled sound. Lace? Then Poirot turned sharply. Yes, madame. From your linen cupboard, a set that went missing a week ago. She opened her mouth, closed it again. Poirot turned to Dr. Bellamy. And you, monsieur, told us the will was to be changed that night, but you failed to mention that you were the one to draft it. Bellamy's face darkened. That's confidential. Poirot cut in, gently but firmly. Yet you spoke of Lionel's guilt, his desire to right a wrong. He had, in recent weeks, learned something terrible, something that led him to strike Alicia from his will. All eyes turned to her. Alicia's face was pale. He what? Poirot nodded. Oui, mademoiselle. He believed you had stolen from him. Paintings, jewelry. He believed you intended to sell them in Paris. He had receipts from a gallery, but he was wrong. A beat passed. You see, Poirot said softly, the gallery owner was paid to lie. The sales had occurred, but not by Alicia. They were traced to someone else. He turned. To you, Mrs. Langford. Beatrix reeled backward, as if struck. Lies! No, madame, Poirot said, stepping closer. You knew Lionel trusted you. You had access to the safes. But then he began to suspect. He found one of the receipts, and instead of confronting you, he assumed it was Alicia. That is why he called for me, but he never told me who he suspected. That he kept close. Too close. Her hands curled into fists. I took nothing that wasn't mine. 30 years I gave that man. 30 years of servitude, of devotion. And for what? A girl with paint on. Her hands to take it all? Poirot's voice was almost a whisper now. So, you waited until the others had gone. You brought him his nightcap. He offered you one last kindness, didn't he? Asked you to sit, and then you raised the gun. Her face crumpled. He was going to ruin me, she said quietly. He wrote me out of everything, said it was wrong to reward silence, that I should have spoken. I had protected him all my life, but that night, I was tired of being invisible. Poirot stood in silence for a long moment. Then he bowed his head. That evening, as the police took Mrs. Langford away, Alicia stood beneath the arbor, where the roses still glistened with dew. Poirot joined her, his shoes crunching on gravel. He died, thinking I betrayed him, she whispered. I wish I could hate him, but I can't. Poirot said nothing for a time, then gently, the dead, they leave behind echoes, mademoiselle. Sometimes bitter, sometimes kind, but always incomplete. It is the living who must finish the melody. She looked at him. Do you believe she ever loved him? Poirot's moustache twitched slightly. Ah, perhaps she loved the man he was, until she realized he would never love her back the way she imagined. Love, mademoiselle, can turn even the gentlest heart into something sharp. As he walked away, the wind passed through the rose garden, lifting the scent of earth and iron. And Poirot, looking once more over the red blooms, murmured to himself, yes, the roses, they bloomed red. But they were not always flowers. Chapter 12. Her tears were never real, and neither was her grief. The first scream came not from the widow, but from the maid. It was sharp, wet, and tore through the stone hallways of Dunscombe House like a blade slicing velvet. Poirot stood beneath the great oil painting of Admiral Dunscombe, his moustache catching the flicker of candlelight. As the maid staggered into the corridor, blood smeared across her hands, her apron trembling as if it too were afraid. "He's dead," she whispered. "Oh God, he's really dead." A second later came the sound of something fragile, porcelain perhaps, shattering in the drawing room where Eliza Dunscombe had been serving tea. But no sobs followed, no gasps, only silence. Poirot moved slowly, purposefully, toward the study. He did not rush. He never rushed. To hurry, mon cher, is to miss the detail that speaks. The body of Ambrose Dunscombe, the wealthy antiquarian and husband of the weeping lady down the hall, lay slumped in his favorite leather armchair, an empty glass still caught between two fingers. A dark stain bloomed across his waistcoat, its shape far too neat to be the result of natural causes. The decanter of sherry on the side table remained nearly full. On the floor, a letter, half-burned, half-read, was curled like a dead moth near the fireplace. Eliza entered moments later. She didn't stumble. Her hands were clean. Her face was tear-streaked, yes, but her cheeks were oddly dry beneath the streaks. Too dry, Poirot thought. Her hand fluttered to her chest in a gesture that might have once been instinctive, but now looked rehearsed. I can't believe it," she whispered. "He was just in here. We'd spoken. He said he needed a moment alone." She glanced down at the body, then away, too quickly. Poirot's eyes narrowed by the width of a hair. In the days that followed, the storm that battered the cliffs outside matched the tension inside the manor. Wind howled through, the narrow windows slamming shutters, rattling the bones of the old house. Everyone claimed to have heard nothing that night, yet the study's door had not been locked, and the fire had been freshly stoked. Hastings, ever faithful and occasionally oblivious, leaned closer to Poirot over breakfast and murmured, "A simple tragedy, wouldn't you say? Perhaps heart failure brought on by stress." Poirot folded his napkin slowly. "Non, mon ami. When the heart fails, it does not arrange the body like a stage performance. And our widow, she cries as an actress cries, when the audience demands it." He sipped his coffee. "Non, I believe someone performed a most deliberate act. 3 people, Poirot observed, had reasons to want Ambrose dead. Each wore grief like a tailored coat, presentable, appropriate, and easily removed. First, there was George Marlowe, Ambrose's protégé and the curator of the Dunscombe collection, a brilliant young man, sharp-suited and sharp-tongued, who had once been heard arguing with Ambrose in the library over a certain missing relic, a 16th-century ring said to carry a papal seal. He was squandering the legacy, Marlowe snapped, when pressed, selling pieces to American collectors, carving up history for a profit. Then Lady Honoria Vale, Ambrose's sister-in-law and self-declared medium. She wore a veil indoors, claimed to speak to the dead, and had told Poirot, with wide, fluttering eyes, that Ambrose had invited a curse upon himself by disturbing a Roman tomb during his last trip to Sicily. Poirot did not believe in curses, but he did believe in convenient inventions. Finally, there was Eliza herself, the grieving widow, young enough to be Ambrose's daughter, married only a year. She spoke of love often, but her eyes, Poirot noted, never quite reached her words. On the morning after the murder, Poirot watched her touch the frame of a photograph, not of Ambrose, but of herself, alone, standing by a marble fountain. He adored me, she told Poirot. I never asked for the estate, you know. I would give it all back to have him here again. And yet during his inspection of her jewelry box, granted by a polite but firm request, Poirot noticed something odd. A sapphire ring, set in an antique style, far older than her other trinkets. When asked, Eliza claimed it was a gift from Ambrose, but Poirot recalled seeing that very ring, weeks ago, described in an Italian auction catalogue. It had vanished before the sale. Ah, but let us not jump to conclusions, n'est-ce pas? Poirot walked the house at night. The wind moaned through the halls like an old memory. He traced footsteps in the dust near the east corridor, faint but present. They led to the locked wing, the one Lady Honoria claimed had been shut for years. Inside, the rooms were empty, but for dust and secrets. One room, however, held a surprise, a broken window latch and a single fresh footprint on the windowsill. Someone had climbed in or out recently. The next morning, Poirot summoned the house guests. Rain lashed the windows behind him as he stood by the great hearth. "My friends," he began, "we are surrounded by masks. The mask of civility, the mask of sorrow. But when it slips, c'est là. The truth reveals itself." He turned first to George Marlowe. "You did not kill Ambrose, but you did steal the ring, intending to sell it yourself, and blame Ambrose for its disappearance. That is why you argued. That is why you were in the study 2 nights before the murder, but not the night of the crime." Marlowe's face went pale, but he said nothing. Poirot turned to Lady Honoria. "You speak of curses. You claimed Ambrose had disturbed a tomb. But you, madame, have disturbed something far more delicate. Trust. You concocted a séance the week before, whispering that the spirits warned of death. Yet your visions came too perfectly timed. You meant only to frighten him, perhaps gain leverage over his will. But murder? No, that is not your style." And then Poirot faced Eliza. "You wept, madame. Oh, how you wept, but only when seen. When alone, you stared into mirrors with a stillness that was unsettling." Eliza's eyes flickered. "How dare you?" Poirot stepped closer. "I will tell you how. You married him not for love, but for access. You are not who you claim. Your real name is Elise Martineau. You changed it after fleeing France 8 years ago, when a benefactor in Toulouse died mysteriously, leaving you everything." Gasps. "I discovered this from a letter, half-burned in the grate. It was not Ambrose's words, but yours. A draft you had written and feared would be discovered. In it, you threatened him. He had found out. He knew." Eliza shook her head violently. No, You slipped the poison into his sherry while pretending to fetch his coat. You wore gloves. You wiped the glass after the maid never saw. And when you entered the room after his death, so composed, so staged, your performance began." Poirot's voice dropped. "But you forgot one thing. Real grief cannot be rehearsed. It is messy. It is irrational. It is not convenient." Eliza's mask cracked. At last. "You think I wanted this life?" she hissed. "Do you know what it's like? Being nothing, watching men hold the world while you rot in corners. I gave him everything he asked for. And, in the end, he would have cast me out like an old coat. So I took what I deserved." The silence that followed was heavy, not just with revelation, but with something darker. The knowledge that murder, for some, is not born of hate, but of cold, patient calculation. As the constable led her away, Eliza did not cry. Her face was as dry as it had been the night Ambrose died. Hastings stood beside Poirot, still stunned. "I truly believed her tears," he murmured. Poirot's moustache twitched. "Yes, mon ami. That is the danger. When one weeps too perfectly, one must ask, for whom are the tears performed?" He turned toward the rain-streaked window. "Grief, Hastings," he said softly, "is the one emotion that cannot lie. And yet, when worn as costume, it becomes the most dangerous deception of all."